FC in Academic Studies, Review of Vasquez, 1994, FC Authorship Study. Welcome to another critique of facilitated communication.
Why is it that most of the time, most of the autistic individuals are not looking at the keyboard?
In today's video, I'm reviewing an early authorship study that proponents claim proves authorship in facilitated communication. Carol Vasquez, Brief Report, a Multitask Controlled Evaluation of Facilitated Communication. Note I'm going to highlight some key points from this study, but I encourage you to read the study in full and leave your comments below. Although proponents claim that the controlled authorship studies from the 1990s, the ones that proved facilitators and not their clients were controlling FC-generated messages, are irrelevant or unethical, proponents do include some studies from that era on their reference lists, studies that they claim prove that FC works as an independent form of communication. I think it's helpful to look at studies like this one to see if we can learn the differences between controlled versus uncontrolled authorship studies. That is, which studies into FC, S2C, and RPM control for facilitated behaviors to rule in or rule out facilitator cueing and control over letter selection, and those that are poorly controlled or perhaps uncontrolled altogether. The poorly controlled or uncontrolled studies tend to be listed on pro-FC websites and reference lists. What form of FC was being studied in 1994? In 1994, touch-based FC was the primary form of FC. Facilitators supported their clients by holding onto their wrists, elbows, shoulders, or other body parts. The purported no-touch forms of FC, like spelling to communicate and rapid prompting method, would come later. But even in 1994, researchers were aware of the pitfalls of what some researchers, for example Wheeler et al., called facilitator contamination through physical contact and verbal interaction. Note, perhaps verbal cueing played a lesser role than physical cueing in traditional touch-based FC, but verbal cues, along with visual cues, play a significant role in the newer forms of FC. What did Vasquez say was the reason for this study? To address the apparent egregious underestimation of the linguistic and cognitive competence of autistic people who were never taught to read or write. To test the validity of FC with autistic subjects while controlling for cueing or experiment or bias effects. When I read about researchers or educators underestimating the linguistic and cognitive competence of autistic people, I wonder why then facilitators use pseudoscientific methods with their clients or loved ones and not legitimate evidence-based augmentative and alternative communication. But I guess that's a question for another day. IRBs and informed consent. Can individuals who are being subjected to FC consent to testing? Many reliably controlled studies are approved and overseen by an institutional review board, or IRB, or some other oversight committee. The purpose of an IRB is to protect the rights and welfare of research participants. For more information about IRBs, please see studies like this one, Capilli et al., Ethical Research and the Institutional Review Board, an Introduction. In this case, testing was set up in accordance with the ethical guidelines of the American Psychological Association. Informed consent was obtained from the parents. The researchers in this study seem to think that it was okay to allow the students to consent to testing using FC-generated responses. Note, because authorship with FC, S2C, and RPM is under question and likely facilitator controlled, informed consent cannot and should not be obtained using those techniques. If legally able, a non-speaking person could give informed consent if he or she was able to communicate using a legitimate form of augmentative and alternative communication independently and without interference from a facilitator. Participants, researchers, and equipment. The two participants, Ben and Eva, in this study were selected because of their success with FC and had used FC for at least a year. The staff members involved with the testing were familiar to the students. No special equipment was required for the testing, and a Canon communicator, model CC7S with the tape printout, was used for all the tasks. Common pictures were used from the expressive one-word picture vocabulary test. Test protocols. The first set of activities included a picture identification task with no controls on the facilitator. In other words, the facilitator could see the pictures, and a picture identification task with controls. The facilitator closed his or her eyes when pictures were presented to the participants. The researcher, the person who presented the pictures to the participants and facilitators, held each picture up without looking at it and purportedly could only see the backs of the pictures. On each trial of the picture identification task, the participant was asked to name the picture by typing out the word on the Canon communicator using facilitated communication and the support of his or her facilitator. Results of the picture identification tasks. Correct responses for Ben in non-blinded trials, 10 out of 10. Correct responses for Ben in blinded trials, 0 out of 10. Correct responses for Eva in non-blinded trials, 10 out of 10. Correct responses for Eva in blinded trials, 2 out of 10. Both subjects' answers on blind trials included meaningful but incorrect words, in other words, facilitator guesses. The next task included videos ranging from 2.5 to 5 minutes in length. Ben on separate days was shown videos with the following stories: a man who made rockets in his garage, men canoeing on a lake, 1992 Olympic men's marathon. I wonder why these films were picked for Ben. Were these interests of his? Did his facilitators know that they were interests of his? Those questions were not answered in the report. Eva was shown videos with the following stories: a woman explaining how she was painting a wall with sponges and a brush, whales breaching in an ocean, and a small boat with a man in it. Again, why were these films chosen for Eva? Were they interests of hers? Did the facilitators know? The facilitator and experimenter were not in the room when the videos were shown, but did they know the topics of the 5 films for the study? That would narrow down facilitator guesses considerably if they did. The report didn't address this issue. After the participants watched the films, the experimenter and facilitator asked some questions about the videos. It seems like it would make more sense if the participants were asked to just spell out something that happened in the videos. It seems like having the researchers ask a bunch of questions could inadvertently cue them into particular answers. The report didn't address this potential source of cueing. Results of the video task. Ben responded with context-appropriate answers on the canoeing video, but the facilitated responses for the other videos were incorrect. In other words, the facilitator was able to guess the content of the canoe video. On all of the videos, Ben and Eva both typed nonsense and/or meaningful phrases that were irrelevant to the topic of the videos. In other words, facilitator guesses that were incorrect. The final task involved object identification, and I should note that Ben did not complete the object identification task. Correct responses for Eva in the object identification non-blinded task, 9 out of 10. Correct responses for Eva in the object identification blinded task, 9 out of 10. The 2 correct type responses were marked as semantic confusions, cup for bowl, and COART, or coat, for glove. A caveat to the object identification task. The researchers reported being surprised that Eva spoke the correct names of many of the objects she was asked to type. However, because the facilitator was within auditory range of Eva saying the objects' names aloud, the researchers could not determine which of the two, Eva or the facilitator, controlled letter selection when the words were spelled via facilitated communication. In other words, Eva inadvertently unblinded the facilitator by speaking aloud the names of the objects. The researchers noted that on 5 of the blind trials, the controls seemed intact. For example, Eva didn't say the name of the object for the facilitator to hear. On one trial, Eva said watch but typed pen, a correct answer. On another, she said nothing but typed the correct answer. And on 3 other blind trials, Eva pushed the facilitator away and typed the answers by herself. In other words, Eva had pre-existing spoken and written language skills that were not accounted for before the testing began. Discussion. Key points about the study made by the study's author. The study provided evidence for genuine communication from the participants, but it also provided strong evidence for direct cueing between the subject and facilitator. Each subject was able to report information unknown to the facilitator in 1 out of 4 controlled sessions. Despite reports of word-finding difficulties in facilitated individuals by FC proponents, one of the participants, Eva, had no difficulties with the object identification task. There was strong evidence in the picture identification task for facilitator cueing, given that correct answers were typed at a rate of 100% for the trials where the facilitator could see the pictures and was not blinded from the test stimuli. Evidence of facilitator cueing was also reported in responses in trials where the FC-generated messages were meaningful, they were spelled correctly, but irrelevant to the target picture, video, or object. The researcher speculated that in the trials where meaningful but correct responses were spelled out, perhaps the subjects simply typed the words they knew how to write. To the researcher, this pattern of apparent meaningful but irrelevant responses underscored the limitations of qualitative methods to validate facilitation. I disagree. I think the facilitators were the ones controlling letter selection. But I suspect this speculative point by the author is what attracts proponents to this study. However, had the participants received a complete speech-language evaluation before the testing, the researcher would have known that Eva had existing language and literacy skills, even if limited, and would not have been surprised by her ability to verbally label and independently type the names of common objects. How did the school staff respond to the test results? Perhaps because school personnel were already invested in the idea that the students were, via FC-generated messages, performing at grade level, the school officials disputed the evidence for cueing and stopped participating in the FC authorship study. Implications of the study. I can see why proponents have this study on their reference list, given the final comments by the researcher who characterized FC as somewhere between a miracle and a hoax. On the one hand, she said, evidence of cueing lends itself to suggestions of fraud or pseudoscience. On the other hand, she said, cueing might be part of the process, a normal part of language acquisition to very young children. I recently talked about all forms of cueing in FC with a licensed speech-language pathologist who specializes in evidence-based augmentative and alternative communication. Her take on the cueing is that, yes, sometimes a client needs help from the SLP to learn how to do a task, but the SLP I talked with fades the cue within the same lesson. In other words, she doesn't keep cueing the client for 20 or 30 years, as is the case with some facilitators today. That's not independent communication. That's facilitator cueing and control. In all the FC materials I've read over the years and videos I've watched, I've never come across specific protocols to fade cueing. In fact, in an article I read within the past year, facilitators were encouraged to quote-unquote prompt their hearts out, then fade, fade, fade. But there was no direct instruction on how facilitators were to fade, fade, fade. And finally, the author of the study suggests that perhaps there are some people who might benefit from FC, such as Eva. This was, after all, 1994 and not 2026. And I think it's this hope that current-day facilitators cling to. Perhaps their client or loved one is one of the few with which FC miraculously works. And perhaps they, the facilitators, are the exception to the rule that facilitators wittingly or unwittingly cue their clients during letter selection. Where things stand today. FCS2C and RPM continue to be promoted in the US and other countries despite the fact that to date there are no reliably controlled authorship studies that prove proponent claims that FC in any of its forms produces independent communication. Rather, the studies, such as the one we reviewed today, show that facilitators, not those being subjected to FC, are controlling letter selection. Most major speech, language, and autism organizations oppose the use of FC, S2C, and RPM, citing lack of scientific evidence, concerns about prompt dependency and facilitator cueing and control over letter selection, lost opportunity costs, both financial and in terms of accessing legitimate, evidence-based methods and techniques, and potential harms, including false allegations of abuse and safety issues. This excerpt from the American Speech Language Hearing Association's statement opposing FC sums up the responsibilities of professionals whose job it is to recommend scientifically rigorous, evidence-based methods and techniques when programming for individuals with significant communication deficits. The substantial and serious risks of facilitated communication outweigh any anecdotal reports of its benefit. The scientific evidence against FC, evidence of harms of FC, and potential for future harms to people who use FC and their families cannot be ignored in clinical decision making. SLPs who use FC, despite being informed of and knowing these harms and risks, could face additional risks in terms of their own liability in the event of harms arising to people with disabilities or their families related to the use of FC. For more information about FC, S2C, and RPM, including opposition statements, controlled studies, systematic reviews, court cases, and documented harms, please visit facilitatedcommunication.org. If you like this video and/or would like to see more content like this, please subscribe, like, share, and comment below. Note for proponents of FC, S2C, and RPM. If you have reliably controlled evidence regarding FC, S2C, and RPM, and/or the existence of telepathy and non-speaking individuals being subjected to these techniques, please provide a link to your sources with your comment, or enough of a title description so that I can search for it. Anecdotes, testimonials, and insults and attacks are not reliably controlled evidence. Thank you for watching until the very end, and remember, FC is not science.